So if you've been wondering what the exposure triangle in photography is, then you're in the perfect place, because in this video, I'm going to explain what exposure is, the three elements that control it, and how they all work together in something called the exposure triangle. And as a bonus, I'll be showing you how you can put all this together in practice to take better photos. So if you're new here, hi, my name is Audrey-Anne from Live Snap Love, where I help you master your camera so you can beautifully capture your children, your family, and the world around you. Do make sure that you hit that subscribe button and you'll stay in the loop for all our new videos that get released every week. And you'll find links to everything we mention in the video along with extra resources in the description underneath. So do make sure that you check that out. But for now, let's dive into the exposure triangle. So let's start by looking at what exposure actually is. So just like our eyes, your camera needs light in order to see and record the scene in front of it. Now, if you have too much light coming into the camera, then your image will be overexposed. In other words, it's going to be too light. If you don't have enough light coming into the camera, then your image is going to be too dark. In other words, underexposed. So getting correct exposure is nothing more than controlling how much light we let come into the camera and hit the sensor. In other words, how long our camera sensor is exposed to the light in order to make sure that our image is neither too light nor too dark. Now, when you are shooting in auto mode, your camera takes care of this for you. It does everything for you automatically. But in order to get better photos and get away from that snapshot quality, then we want to learn how to control this so that we can control how the final image looks. And the first step in being able to do that is to understand the different ways that your camera sensor is exposed to the light. So there are three different elements that help you obtain correct exposure, and they are, in no particular order, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now, each of these controls how much light is coming into the camera and therefore your exposure. So let's take a look at each of them individually. So aperture is basically the size of an opening, a hole really in your lens that lets light into your sensor. So a large opening allows more light in and a smaller opening less light. By controlling our aperture, we are simply controlling the size of that hole. So the size of that hole is controlled by the f-stop. So you'll see that written in your camera as something like f2.8, f5.6, or f13, or anything in between. So we basically change that number in order to change the size of that hole to make it larger, to let more light in, or smaller to let less light in. And you can see that in this diagram here. So you can see that at f16, there at that first image there on the top left, you have the smallest hole. And then as we work down through that aperture numbers, all the way down to f1.4, you can see that that size of that hole, the size of that aperture, keeps getting bigger and bigger. So the second element in our exposure triangle is shutter speed. And shutter speed simply refers to how fast or how slow the shutters in our camera open or close. So the light comes into your camera via the aperture, that hole in your camera lens. And then behind that sits your shutters. Now just think of shutters as being like curtains over the aperture. So they literally open and close over the aperture hole. If they open and close slowly, then you let lots of light into the camera. If they open and close quickly, then you let less light into the camera. So that's all your shutter speed is controlling those shutters, or if you like to think of it as being curtains over the hole, your aperture, how quickly they open and close. And you'll see this written as a number, usually with a 1 in front of it. So 1 over 125, 1 over 500, or 1 over 3000, for example. So the last element in our exposure triangle is something called ISO, and this is your camera's sensitivity to light. Now, it doesn't let light into the camera in the same way that your aperture and your shutter speed does. It controls how sensitive the camera's sensor is to the light. So the light is coming in via your aperture and being allowed in via your shutter speed, how fast or how slow that shutter is open and close, and then it hits your camera's sensor. So ISO is simply how sensitive that sensor is to the light. So a smaller ISO number is less sensitive to light. A higher ISO number is more sensitive to light. Now, it doesn't exactly work like this in a mathematical sense, but I like to think of it this way because I think it's easier. If you can think of having receptors there on your sensor, if you had ISO 100, you would have 100 of those receptors picking up that light. If you had a higher number, let's say ISO 6400, think of it as having 6,400 sensors on your sensor. It's picking up more of the light that your camera's getting in through its aperture and its shutter speed. Now, as I said, it doesn't actually work like that in practice, but it's a useful way of thinking of it. That higher ISO number means your camera is more sensitive to the light that's coming in via your aperture and your shutter speed. So right now you might be wondering, where does this darn triangle that everyone keeps talking about come into it? Well, the triangle is simply a way of showing that there's a relationship between all three of these elements and that they're all actually connected. So think of it this way, when you get the correct exposure, all of these three elements are nicely balanced and you have that stable triangle. If you then went on to change just one of these elements, our perfect triangle would go out of whack and no longer be balanced. To get our triangle back into shape and get our exposure correct again, then we need to change one or both of the other two elements to compensate for the changes we made. So let me give you a real life example of that. So let's say that you have your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO number all set, and you have perfect exposure in camera. Then you decide to increase your shutter speed. That is going to let less light into the camera, and then all of a sudden you have an underexposed image. So where this triangle comes in is basically saying that you can then change either of those two remaining elements to make up for that lost light. So we could either open up our aperture to let in more light, or we could increase our ISO, in other words, our camera's sensitivity to light. So once we make that change, so we've let less light in by increasing our shutter speed, but we can compensate for that by increasing the size of our aperture and letting more light in. So then we have our triangle back in shape. So it's really just that way of showing that when you change one element, you can change some of the other elements as well. Every single thing there is connected. Now, when you use auto mode in your camera is doing all of this for you. It is choosing which aperture to use, which shutter speed to use, which ISO to use, and it is keeping our exposure triangle balanced to maintain a correct exposure. Now, this is wonderful in many ways because it allows absolutely anyone to pick up a camera and take an image without having any knowledge of these three elements and what they do. But when you are actually interested in getting good images, you do need to move away from the auto mode in your camera for two reasons. So the first reason simply is that your camera cannot see and react to a scene in the way that we can. So it can't really determine correct exposure correctly all of the time. We need to do that sometimes, absolutely. But the second reason is because aperture, shutter speed, and ISO don't just control how much light is coming into our camera and therefore our exposure, they're also controlling how our images look. Aperture controls depth of field. In other words, how much or how little of our scene is in focus. If we have, for example, we want a portrait image, we might just want our subject in focus and we might want to blur out the background. That's that images you see where the subject seems to pop off the screen, they're in sharp focus, and everything else behind is blurred and out of focus. On the other hand, we might want a landscape image where we want everything from near to far in focus. So aperture allows us to control that, how much of our scene is in focus. Shutter speed also has an effect on how our images look. Specifically, it controls how we capture motion. We can choose whether to use a slow shutter speed and therefore show the motion through blurring, or we can choose to use a faster shutter speed and freeze the action instead. So again, shutter speed is controlling how our images look. And the same goes for your ISO number. A higher ISO number is going to introduce some grain or noise into your images. So all three control exposure, in other words, how light or how dark our images are, and they also control how our images look. So as a photographer, you want to take control over all three elements so you can determine the best exposure for the scene, which is not always what your camera thinks it's going to be, and so you can decide how your image actually is going to look. Because when your camera does this in auto, it doesn't know whether you want to blur out the background, it doesn't know whether you want to freeze the motion or anything along those lines. It just goes for middle of the road settings, hopefully covering all eventualities or most. And that means you end up with images that have a kind of middle of the road snapshot quality to them. And that, as photographers, is obviously something that we want to avoid. So learning all three elements of the exposure triangle is so important if you want to learn how to get great photos. So I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I was also going to help you with your next step. So now that we have a basic knowledge of the exposure triangle, our next step is to learn how to control these elements. And I recommend that you do this by switching to something called Aperture Priority Mode. What this is a semi-automatic mode, whereas you get to control one element of that exposure triangle, in this case aperture, and you are going to leave the camera to do the other two, shutter speed and ISO. So you still have that safety net there of the camera choosing the other settings and balancing the exposure. But just taking control of one element will help you see how the exposure triangle works, and it will also help you get creative control over how your image looks by blurring out the background or having everything from near to far in focus. Now, I have a full 8-page guide on shooting in Aperture Priority Mode. It will run through the basics of exposure again for you, give you some more information, and give you a step-by-step guide to shooting in Aperture Priority Mode, and we're going to use that to blur out the background. So go to the link in the description underneath this video and you'll see a link to that free guide, your Aperture Priority Mode cheat sheet. Go and download that. You can follow the steps laid out in that guide. As I said, it's very step-by-step, very, very actionable, and you can take your first steps away from auto and start learning about how you can use the exposure triangle to get better photos. Now, we have lots of other videos to help you get better photos. I've linked to several in the description underneath this video, and you should see a couple pop up on your screen right now. Don't also forget to subscribe so that you'll stay in the loop for new videos which are released every single week. And if you have a question or a comment, then you can leave that below. Otherwise, I will see you guys next week. Thanks for being here. Bye for now.